Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to this Facebook Live with the Student Lawyer and also Apportunity. My name's Edward Walker, but before I do any detailed introductions and just while we wait for other people to join the session, would anyone who's logged in possibly just be able to confirm using the comments feed that they're able to hear me okay and also see? Hi Charlotte, I can see that you've just joined the session. If you could just confirm that you can hear me okay on the audio, that'd be great. Fantastic, that's great to hear. I can see we've got a number of people logging in, but I'll give people a few moments grace before we start the session. But for those of you who have logged in already, if you want to start thinking about any questions that you may like to ask over the next half an hour, then either jot those down on a piece of paper, or if you're already ready to share those, then feel free to put those in the comments section over the coming minutes. Okay, well, I'm always keen to make sure that those people who arrive on time get the full benefit of the session. So what I would like to do is just give you a short introduction to what we're going to be looking to cover off in the next half an hour. But I'll start off just by giving you a brief introduction to myself and also those people who have brought you the session tonight. So my name is Edward Walker. I'm a psychologist and careers coach, but prior to becoming that sort of line of work, I did 10 years working in graduate recruitment, working for a number of different companies, but most recently I spent 6 years working for Pinsent Mason, so a large international law firm. During that period of time, I was responsible for the recruitment of trainees and school leavers to the business, and also alongside that I represented the legal sector for the Association of Graduate Recruiters. So hopefully that will give you the confidence that whatever I tell you tonight certainly has some good grounding in reality in terms of how the recruitment for trainee solicitor positions, vacation schemes, etc. goes. Alongside that, I'd also like to just say thank you to both Apportunity and the Student Lawyer who have sponsored tonight's event. You already probably have a pretty good idea about what both those companies do, but just for reference, Apportunity is a recent venture that is there to try and help students who are looking for advice and guidance in relation to law firm applications. They're able to help put you in touch with a number of people who have worked in the industry, people such as myself, and they can give you advice on both applications that you may be looking to make or also give you some mock interview practice. In terms of the Student Lawyer, as you're probably already aware, student-run publication and very much the go-to place for all things commercial awareness related. So if you've not had the chance to see either of those two yet, do check out their details at the end of the session and pay them a visit. In terms of today's session, though, really we've got a couple of different areas that I'm going to look to cover off. As you know, the actual sort of subject is Brexit and how the implications for law firms, and I'm going to look at that from a couple of different angles. But really, it's going to be the quality of the questions that you ask that will hopefully mean you get the most possible out of the session. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense as to perhaps what are some of the general implications of Brexit for law firms, but also try and think about it in terms of your applications to law firms as well, and what sort of approaches you might want to take when thinking about, for example, application forms, but also maybe if you're asked a question about Brexit in an interview as well. As is always the case, though, don't take what I say as absolute gospel. Things vary very much between firms, but hopefully some of this will give you a bit of general guidance and one or two pointers that will give you a chance to then go away and do some independent thought over the coming days and weeks. So, if we start off then with what I suppose is the overall implication for Brexit on law firms as a whole. Well, in many senses, law firms aren't that different to a number of other businesses, and I suppose what they get frustrated by is general uncertainty in the economic environment. Law firms, as a number of companies do, have to make long-term investment decisions. And for law firms in particular, where it takes a long time to train up lawyers, as a number of you all know, often people get recruited in their penultimate year at university and then still perhaps have a year or two of further study before even starting a training contract. something like Brexit is going to make it very difficult, perhaps, for a law firm trying to work out how many trainees they may need in 2020 to put an accurate figure on that. And ultimately, of course, the number of trainees that are recruited is very much driven by what is the likely need for qualified lawyers a couple of years after those students have started their training contract. So that probably is the biggest issue that Brexit has caused for law firms from a recruitment perspective. It has increased that level of uncertainty. However, important to remember that law firms obviously work in very complex environments, and Brexit is just one of a number of different things that they're having to grapple with at any one time. So if you think about, again, going back to the recruitment of trainee solicitors, yes, Brexit has raised the level of uncertainty, but what about factors such as the apprenticeship levy? That's something which, again, law firms are having to think about quite carefully. It's a new facet of legal recruitment, which again is going to have implications perhaps on the number of trainees they may look to recruit. Also, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, there have been a number of changes around the routes to qualification, and that's being driven by regulatory change from the SRA. So yes, Brexit is going to make a difference, and for some of you, you may feel that it's going to be a negative because of that increased uncertainty. But it is only one of a number of factors that legal recruiters such as myself would be having to think about. And another thing that's certainly worth thinking about is the actual impact of Brexit won't be felt uniformly across a law firm either, particularly those that are full service firms that have a wide variety of different practice areas. If you think about, again, what are the implications of Brexit for specific areas of law, for some it will be a positive. Sometimes that increased uncertainty for business will drive a demand for legal services from those clients because they need extra advice in order to try and cope with what is now a more uncertain environment that they're operating in. Equally, for some other areas of a law firm, it may be if their, business is driven by deal flow, mergers and acquisitions, for example, then obviously a reduction in that sort of activity may be a net negative for them. But again, something that's always worth thinking about, whether you're considering what might be the implications for you and your career, but also when thinking about how you tackle maybe an application form question or an interview question. It's not always going to be a simple, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. It's very much going to be trying to pick out some of those nuances. So that was a little bit of general background around Brexit itself, but I would certainly encourage you to think about having a look at what perhaps different law firms have said on their website. A number of them have already written their own position papers for clients, and obviously picking those out, which are often free for people to download from the website, will give you a sense of what a law firm's talking about as being the potential pros and cons for their clients. And you can obviously think about that in relation to law firms themselves as businesses as well. Moving on, though, just now very briefly to application forms and interviews. As I've already hinted, don't think that if you are asked about Brexit that there will necessarily be a right or a wrong answer, as is often the case in law firm interviews. It's not about there being a particular answer that the interviewer is looking for. What they're also always tending to prefer to understand is what is it that's actually brought you to perhaps your particular conclusion. Whether you think Brexit is a good thing or a bad thing, what were the different factors you took into account when actually arriving at that decision, and how are you able to best explain that to them, hopefully in fairly sort of plain language. So again, things that you may want to consider is what are the implications for the particular firm that you're applying to, and as we've talked about, you can have a look at perhaps the areas that they do most business in to help guide you with that. Equally again, what have perhaps some of the firm's clients been saying about Brexit, because that will often have implications for the firms that obviously get instructed by them. But alternatively, think beyond the firm that you're applying to as well. Consider what perhaps are some of the competitor firms doing. How are they reacting to Brexit? What has been their strategy? Has it impacted perhaps on where they're looking to open their offices? Some of you may have noticed recently there's been a large degree of talk about perhaps looking to get people dual qualified so that they can practice both within the EU and outside if obviously the UK goes down that route. And that's had an impact, for example, maybe for the recruitment of lawyers in Dublin, I think, for example. So those are the sorts of things which you can perhaps be on the lookout to spot. And just because it's something which maybe the firm you're applying to hasn't done, don't think that you can't mention that you haven't noticed things that perhaps their competitors are doing, because that, again, helps demonstrate your overall awareness of the legal market. And a final point before I really sort of hand over to your own questions is always worth thinking about, not just in terms of Brexit, but for any question or any sort of interview you may be attending, what is the competency framework of the firm that you're applying to? What are those qualities that they say that they're looking for? Because yes, it is definitely an opportunity for you to demonstrate your commercial awareness talking about Brexit, but it can also be an opportunity for you to demonstrate a number of other qualities. We've talked about your ability to obviously be intellectually curious. That can be something which comes across in an answer to a question on Brexit. And it can also be an opportunity for you to demonstrate your drive and determination to go into law, even though you understand it is now going to be more uncertain than perhaps it was 1 or 2 years ago. But again, Brexit is just one avenue for you to discuss those sorts of topics. You could also, of course, be commenting on a wide range of other topics, such as changes in technology, rise of artificial intelligence, etc. So, that, as I said, was my sort of introduction just to set the scene. I did receive one question in advance, so I will give a little answer to that one as well if that person's tuned in. But otherwise, if you do want to post your own questions in the next few minutes, I will try and make sense of the technology and spot what those are, and hopefully we'll be able to get a bit of extra value out of you for the next few minutes. So, the question I was asked in advance was, I'm worried that Brexit will be covered by the majority of applications, given its magnitude. What would make an answer on Brexit stand out to you when reviewing an application? So, if I'm honest, that's the same question that I used to get asked at law firms, just with the Brexit sort of, I suppose, strapline to it. Basically, how can I try and make my application stand out from all those many others that you're likely to receive in a review as a graduate recruiter? Well, again, boring message, because many of you will have heard about this already. It is about trying to make sure that when you answer a question, you try and demonstrate that you've actually thought about it within the context of what you have to offer and what you're looking for, but also what that firm has to offer and what perhaps they've said on the topic of Brexit. So it is often very easy as a recruiter to spot those sort of canned answers that people have probably drafted and then put on an application form to half a dozen different firms. It's not that those answers will necessarily be incorrect or contain factual errors, but often it'll be relatively generic, and so the things that perhaps will be touched upon in relation to Brexit will be things that might affect any large, for example, international law firm. So what I would encourage you to do if you want to stand out is go back to the basics. Think about what the law firm perhaps talks about in terms of itself when it's marketing itself to clients. What do they perhaps feel make them stand out? What is it that they feel are perhaps their strengths? Equally, you might want to think about what are they not talking about, because that might give a sense of perhaps one of their areas of weakness or a bit of a gap in their service offering. But always try and think about, okay, so what does Brexit mean for a firm that aims to do that for clients? Or what does it mean for a firm that perhaps works in those specific geographical areas or in those particular sectors? And if you can try and pick out the nuances of how Brexit might affect those sorts of clients, those sorts of sectors, those sorts of geographical territories, then that will come across as a much better answer than one that, as I said, is relatively generic. Certainly worth thinking about the differences between, for example, a UK-only firm whose clients are predominantly all UK-based companies or maybe foreign companies looking to do business in the UK, as opposed to a firm that has predominantly EU-based offices, or for those that operate well beyond the EU as well. Each of those firms is going to have a very different attitude towards Brexit, and that should be reflected in your answer. I can see a comment there from Ava. Are we recording this session? Yes, I believe that all of the Facebook Live sessions get automatically recorded and are then uploaded to the Student Lawyer website afterwards. So if there's anything that you've missed perhaps and want to watch again afterwards, not a problem at all. I appreciate I do sometimes speak fairly quickly, but hopefully it is clear. So, are there any other questions that I've not seen? I can only see the latest comments at the moment on my screen. Okay, well, it looks as if it's a fairly standard sort of online session then where the majority of people are going to choose to lurk. That's absolutely fine, not a problem at all. But certainly it does help if I get to hear what are perhaps at the forefront of people's minds. Or interestingly, has anyone actually come across a question yet in an interview or on an application form that specifically touches on Brexit? Is that something which anyone has been actually grappling with over the last week or two? Certainly without mentioning the firms, feel free to give a sense of what sort of questions you've perhaps been asked. And again, happy to give some pointers on what perhaps I would think about if I were a recruiter listening to those sorts of answers. Okay, so I can see a question there from Samantha King. Are there sectors you think are more likely to be affected than others in relation to Brexit? It's a good question. As I mentioned earlier, you've obviously got to think about what sort of clients are operating in specific sectors, and how obviously might they be affected by government changes to legislation that obviously may result as a precursor or following on from Brexit taking place. I suppose some of the obvious areas that would be in the headlines at the moment, what is likely to be perhaps the changes to immigration rules in the UK as a result of Brexit. There's been a lot of discussion at the moment as to whether or not the UK will actually look to particularly change immigration. Are they going to look to tighten it up? Is it going to be more difficult to perhaps hire people from either the EU or out with the EU? So you could think about which sectors of the UK economy are perhaps particularly dependent on bringing in skilled labour from overseas. The university sector is one where there's been quite a lot of talk about will they be able to attract the top academics if there's going to be issues around freedom of movement. So companies or, again, law firms that maybe do quite a bit of work with the HE sector, that may cause implications for them. For some firms, it may generate a lot of opportunities because they'll have to give extra advice in relation to immigration and helping people navigate what may become a much more complex system. Alternatively, for those clients that perhaps have relied heavily in, for example, the construction sector on a large number of migrants coming in to fulfil some of their contracts, that may have implications in terms of their ability to bid effectively for those contracts and may obviously bump up the price of some of those. So those are perhaps areas that you might want to think about. You also might want to think about, for example, there's a lot of uncertainty around what will happen to, for example, intellectual property law, which at the moment is dealt with on a pretty much pan-European level in some respects. Again, I'm not an expert in this area. Some of you will probably know far more about this than myself from your studies. But I understand that I think at some areas, particularly when you're looking at intellectual property that maybe is governed at an EU level across all EU countries, there are European courts that would be seen as the final arbiter for those sorts of disputes. What would happen now if the EU obviously was to no longer have the UK as part of it? How would you perhaps have to change those sorts of contracts? Would it make it more complex for people looking to try and protect their intellectual property across both the UK, the EU and beyond? So again, a couple of different areas that we'll be touching on there. If I'm honest, I think you can probably make a case for Brexit impacting on every sector because, as we've discussed earlier, one of its fundamental, I suppose, implications is a raised level of uncertainty, which again isn't going to be sector specific, but certainly one or two where you can see that legislation and particularly coordination of trade policy is at a European level. They're perhaps likely to see much bigger implications as a result of Brexit. Good question though, and certainly one that I would encourage you to research ahead of any application forms or interviews. Do we have any other questions? One thing I'll mention as well, just while hopefully one or two of you are typing away or at least thinking over one or two questions for me. Certainly worth thinking about Brexit, if you like, as an ongoing news story as well. Something which often used to let students down when they would attend interviews for training contracts or application schemes was they clearly made an effort to read the newspapers over the last week or two. And so perhaps they were aware of what was in the current headlines of the quality press. But certainly for a story like Brexit, it's one which has been developing over a number of months. And again, because of the complexity of what's involved, it's probably worth thinking about which of the aspects of the particular Brexit issue that I'm going to concentrate on. It's not going to be realistic for you to become an expert in all of them, but you could perhaps look to try and watch how is a particular aspect of the Brexit negotiations, which are likely to kick off, I think, in the next few months. How are they going to develop? So you may take an interest in, for example, it could be EU competition law. How is that perhaps going to come up for discussion as part of the negotiations? It may be that you again want to choose a particular sector and see how the reporting of Brexit is being followed within their quality press. Those are the sorts of things which again will hopefully allow you just to talk at a slightly more sophisticated level. It'd be very unlikely in an interview that you would be told or asked the question, what particular, for example, are your views on Brexit and its implications for fisheries? Again, if you want to follow that and it interests you, great, but it's much more normal in an interview. Though people will ask you quite a general question about, so what do you think are the major implications of Brexit, for example, for our law firm or for our clients? So that really is an invitation for you to talk about Brexit in the way that you want. So do think about that going into the interview. What are the particular aspects that I'm most interested in? How can I convey my enthusiasm? And again, for those of you perhaps been studying law, why not think about how it's actually going to complement some of your studies as well? If you're going to put in all that effort, it'd be nice to think it might even help you in one or two of your exams too. Right, I can see another question from Rebecca Underwood. What is Brexit's likely impact on private client work, in particular trust law? Right, I probably should have said this before the start of the session. I am a recruiter and a psychologist, I'm not a lawyer. So my knowledge of trust law, I can tell you, is zero. Never read a legal textbook in my life. However, more generally, what's the likely impact on private client work? You can probably think about that in maybe two senses. So again, I don't know what sort of firms you might be considering applying to. But for people such as yourself or myself, when do we maybe go to a lawyer normally? Perhaps maybe for buying a house, perhaps, or I hate obviously for it to happen, but if we were maybe getting a divorce, provided that's something which I suppose is exclusively within the UK, not necessarily going to be a huge amount of an issue. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I might be buying a second home overseas. But for those law firms that maybe deal with private clients who are very high net worth individuals, obviously they have much more complex arrangements, whether it's in terms of trusts where perhaps they've got money saved, could be around again a property portfolio, maybe looking to make hedges against various currency fluctuations, etc. So for certainly some of those more sophisticated clients, I can imagine Brexit will be something where they are looking to law firms to give them a lot of advice on what that will mean for perhaps their portfolio of assets. So that could be in terms of property, although again at the moment UK property law is sort of pretty distinct how it works within the UK. But certainly some other areas where, for example, there's been a lot of talk about the financial services and the passporting rules that may change as a result of Brexit. For those clients who are used to having London as their base because it's the city and it's the centre of many of those complex products that are done at a European level, Eurobonds, for example. If that were to change, then maybe those law firms wouldn't have that same level of business because London would no longer be seen as being the sort of nexus for both the financial services and the legal services that support that. I hope that's of use. We've got a couple of minutes left before I wrap up, so has anyone got any final questions they would like to ask? It's a huge topic, so I'm sure there must be aspects of Brexit that you are perhaps hoping to hear a bit more about that I've not touched on yet. So just because I've not mentioned it today, don't feel that that means it's off limits. Okay, so I've seen another question this time from Gwenny Rees-Evans. Do you think Brexit could bring any positive outcomes to law firms? Well, I think the answer for that is definitely yes. I mean, if we think about most I suppose uncertainty in financial markets, it often leads to winners and losers. It's about being perhaps nimble enough to respond to that. We've already talked about earlier, for example, some of those areas of law firms that will undoubtedly see work generated as a result of complex change to financial regulations, but also just as obviously EU law is incorporated into UK law, but then from that moment on it starts to shift and change as UK makes amendments, or equally the EU makes amendments that aren't then mirrored within the UK. Those sorts of differences between the legal systems will provide opportunities for lawyers, whether it's to give advice to clients, or sometimes it'll be about perhaps noticing differences and discrepancies, which can allow perhaps, if loopholes arise, opportunities for clients to take advantage of differences between different legal jurisdictions. So that again is something which could be on the lookout for. And also, of course, for law firms that maybe do quite a lot of business with overseas firms, you've got to think about, a lot of people talk about the decline in the value of the pound being a bad thing for the UK. And that can be true if you're certainly someone who's importing. Those imports become a lot more expensive. But it may be that actually, as a result of Brexit, UK lawyers are seen as being relatively cheaper and less expensive than perhaps their European or US counterparts. So for those sorts of situations where maybe the client has an opportunity to decide who to instruct in which country and using which type of legal jurisdiction, it may be actually that the UK legal system becomes a more cost-effective place to do business. So that could be one opportunity that arises as a result of Brexit, should we see the value of the pound remain where it is at the moment. And obviously, as in the legal sector at the moment, cost of fees is a very big issue for clients. So being able to take advantage of that and get your legal work done at a lower cost may be something which would be of interest to international clients. Did you have any ideas of your own, Gwenny, at all? Just out of interest? Okay, so a question from Daniel De Silva. Do you see any UK lawyers moving to European firms such as the ROI as a result of Brexit? It's a good question. I mean, I suppose one of the issues for lawyers is, working in a firm like Pinson Masons, I could see that there were issues in trying to move perhaps between different jurisdictions where often the law is quite different. It probably depends on what practice area you've chosen to specialise in. I certainly saw when people were moving between, for example, the Scottish and the English legal systems, or the English and the Northern Irish legal systems. For some areas, it's a relatively seamless process, and becoming dual qualified is quite straightforward. So that may be something which even post Brexit doesn't stop people going and getting dual qualified in areas such as the Republic of Ireland. Certainly, I know Pinson Masons, my old firm, they've been talking about opening a Dublin office, and I'm sure there will be some existing lawyers who maybe consider going to base themselves there if it's advantageous to their careers. However, it's certainly going to be in some areas something which is unfortunately maybe just not as realistic. Lawyers are not perhaps as footloose as maybe, again, people working in areas such as banking, management, consultancy. So for those of you who are thinking about a long-term career in law, you maybe want to think quite carefully about what practice area do I want to sort of specialise in, not just in the short term because you enjoy it, but also, will it allow me to move, perhaps to different locations, if that's going to be something I need to do as part of my career. Certainly, I know from, again, my experience, areas such as construction, projects, they often use the Welsh and English system of law, even for international disputes and for drawing up contracts in a variety of other countries. So if you've specialised in an area such as that, probably doesn't matter too much where you will actually be physically based. You can probably practice with an English and Welsh legal background, in areas such as Hong Kong, Dubai, etc. But certainly for some other areas, it may mean that English and Welsh law becomes less attractive, and if you've chosen to specialise in one of those areas, it may mean that your career opportunities get limited as a result. But I would imagine probably far too soon to maybe tell on that. But certainly, good question to maybe ask someone at the end of an interview. Often people always want to know, what should I ask the interviewer when I get the chance? Why not ask them a question, something like, if you were starting your legal career now, what practice areas do you think would be ones that you would seriously consider qualifying into, and why? But a good question, Daniel. Well, I think probably time for one more question. Otherwise, I'll look to wrap up the session. But as I said, one final question we can probably squeeze in if anyone has anything that they've not had the chance to ask so far. Okay, so a final question from Daniel there, I can see. In a similar manner, do you see major corporations moving overseas to EU countries? That's a good question. As you'll probably notice, a number of companies look to leverage uncertainty to sometimes try and extract support from government. Financial services companies have been doing that for a number of years in the UK, often threatening to change their headquarters if EU were to perhaps have a more favourable regulatory regime than that's seen in the UK. I think you've always got to ask the question, why do people choose to situate their headquarters where they do? Sometimes it will be down to the legal regulatory framework, without a doubt, but there are going to be a whole host of other possible reasons for choosing a country. Certainly in the UK, we've been very fortunate that English is pretty much the language of business for most areas of the world, and so that would be a reason for perhaps staying in the UK, although perhaps it maybe would make North America relatively more attractive as an alternative. But in terms of moving to EU countries, look at perhaps the situation in France. There's been recent elections there, and the new president has talked very much about trying to really try and attract companies from the UK to go and site themselves in France as a result of Brexit. So looking at those sorts of developments, seeing whether any incentives are given might be something which would drive that. But that's something in addition to Brexit. Perhaps Brexit will give the excuse for the companies to do it, but often it'll be a number of things behind the scenes that do that. It will often not just be down to the regulations, because ultimately they can change very quickly. Nancy, what have you asked? Do you think employment law firms will be hugely effective? I suppose that's something which I touched on earlier when I talked about the impact that it may have or may not have in terms of EU immigration. At the moment, very hard to tell. There's been a number of sort of conflicting statements coming out from various different political parties. Obviously, we're in the throes of an election at the moment. But the general, I suppose, mood music seems to be that the UK needs a number of people to be entering the UK on an annual basis in order to try and help grow the economy and fill those positions which perhaps can't be filled from local sort of employment sources. In which case, it could be a real uptick for employment law firms over the next few years, whether that's in terms of supporting EU students to come and study in the UK or for people looking to come and work here. But again, I would have thought if you are considering applying to a law firm that does quite a bit around EU employment law, they will already be starting to put out feelers in this area. They may again have already started to write position papers for their clients because again a number of clients will be considering long-term investments that maybe will require people to staff them over the next 5, 10, possibly even 20 years, thinking about some of the big infrastructure projects which obviously countries such as the UK undertake. So that would probably be the best way to get an insight. But I think it's certainly one which it will very much depend on how Brexit ultimately comes about and what sort of changes, if any, are made to EU and UK immigration law. But potentially the answer is definitely there could be huge implications for firms that operate in that area, and certainly if it becomes a more complex system, likely to be more work for lawyers, even though the firms involved, or rather the companies involved, would prefer not to have that extra level of regulation. Okay, well, I hope that was useful. That is all the time we've got for questions today. Hopefully you've been able to tease out one or two things which you can think about in relation to your own applications. Obviously, over the weeks and months ahead, keep an eye on the Student Lawyer, who I know will be publishing a number of stories in this area and obviously other areas related to law. So that is definitely a good way to keep up to date on all things commercial awareness. And for those of you who perhaps thought it would be useful to get a bit of advice and guidance in relation to application forms or interviews from people such as myself, then by all means do have a look at Apportunity. I know they've helped a number of students in the past with applications and helped them go on to secure training contracts at a number of leading firms. So again, if you think that could be a useful service as well, then I think their website's got the details. But otherwise, thank you indeed for phoning in and listening to my very first Facebook Live session. I hope it was useful, and hopefully perhaps see you at a future session in the months ahead. Goodbye.